and this is Linda at the company. The important issue to talk about, it's not very complicated. I guess we could have a lot of words to describe what we're trying to do, but I settled for one word, and that is liberty. Understand where liberty comes from and what the responsibility of government is, I think that will result in the best chance of having peace and prosperity throughout the world. But our country today is no longer the country it was a few years back or a few decades back. It certainly isn't the republic that was intended by the Constitution. We no longer have a republican form of government. And the founders were very adamant about it. They talked about a republic versus a pure democracy, and they had very bad feelings about a pure democracy where the 51% could gang up on the minority and dictate the rules of economics or the rules of personal behavior on the minority. And I'm afraid that's where we are today. But the spirit is alive. Let me tell you, in this country, more and more people now are waking up. The people like you are wide awake. You know what's wrong. You know what has to be done. Washington is sound asleep. What we need to do is make sure they hear us and make sure they know what the message is, and that is for liberty. Approximately 100 years ago, we embarked on a different direction. We virtually gave up on the Constitution, and it's been whittled away constantly ever since. And even in the last few years, it's gotten much worse. In spite of the people waking up and wanting something different, we still have a job cut out for ourselves, because Washington isn't hearing us, and they have not changed, but we will make a difference. We will make sure they hear this message. Especially under the Woodrow Wilson administration, things certainly started in the wrong direction. Foreign policy was changed, accepting this so-called idealism of making the world safe for democracy. And look at the last 100 years. It hasn't been very safe, and a lot of people have died, and there's less freedom in the world today, and there's less freedom in this country. Also, a few other things occurred in 1913. A couple things that we should reverse. One, for instance, is the 16th Amendment. I'd like to reverse it. I'd like to repeal it. Now, if we understand truly the Jeffersonian approach to saying that, our life and our liberty comes from our Creator, the consequence ought to be that the fruits of our labor ought to be our own and not the government's. There was one other item that they passed in 1913, and every once in a while I mention, and that was the passage of the Federal Reserve Act. I'd like to repeal that as well. So I think for the 100th anniversary, what we ought to do is repeal the Federal Reserve Act. A lot of people ask me, why do you talk about this money system all the time and the Federal Reserve and concentrating on sound money and the Constitution? Isn't that so old-fashioned? Well, the founders knew something about this. They suffered through the inflation of the continental dollar. There was total destruction of the continental money. And therefore, they didn't want it to happen to us. They wanted to protect us. And they put in the Constitution only gold and silver could be legal tender, and that you could not print paper money, and that you don't have authority to start a central bank. So we've sort of violated that a bit. They didn't amend the Constitution. They just totally ignore it. We now today have a unit of account called a Federal Reserve note, and they all sometimes refer to it as a dollar. But if you ask them, define a dollar, they have no idea how to define a dollar. They say, well, it means it's a Federal Reserve note. So they're trying to protect the value of something they don't even know what it is, and they can't even define it. Then they wonder why they have a mess in Washington and around the world. The dollar and the money issue is so important because it's 1/2 of everything we transact. Whether you're measuring wages or prices or incomes or interest rates, it's all measured by this dollar that you can't define. And then they wonder how we got into this mess. But the whole problem, starting in 1913, was to establish a growth path for big government. You know, whether it was the income tax. Unfortunately, Jefferson lost the argument at the beginning of our country when he argued we shouldn't be able to borrow, but we've been able to borrow all this time. So they also then said, well, taxes are limited because the people will rebel. The market limits borrowing because the interest rates will go too high. So that's why we had to have a central bank, because if we come up short, the federal government can always take their bills and their debt and send it to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve just prints the money. It sounds good, sounds like a good thing, especially if it works, and it worked for a while. It works for a while until the country gets too much in debt. And even 20, 30 years ago, the debt wasn't that outrageous. But we were a creditor nation. We were on the positive side, even during the Depression. Today, we are the biggest debtor nation in the history of the world. And they think the solution is spend more money and print more money. It's virtual insanity to think you can get out of trouble by doing the mistakes that have brought on the trouble. That's why we have to think about monetary policy, listen to the founders, and say, take away the power of the government and the Federal Reserve to create money out of thin air to finance wars. Is a moral and a constitutional issue, but it's also very much of a government issue, government growth issue. Because it accommodates and it hides the bills for a while, governments can grow. So certainly, look at 1913 on. The entitlement system developed, the warmongering developed. Quickly after the Federal Reserve came into effect, they financed World War I. We had a depression in 1920-21. That depression lasted only 1 year because they weren't compelled by Keynesian economic theory to prolong the agony by propping up all the bad debt. There were no bailouts. So that depression ended a year. But by 1930, when the next depression came, Keynesian economics took over and said, they're too big to fail. We can't let them fail. We have to. We're good managers of the economy. We say economic planning works, and we can get out of it. What did they do? They gave us a depression that lasted 17 years. And you'd think that would wake the people up, but it hasn't. They argued the case back then that the reason that we had a depression was because of the gold standard and also because of free markets. Well, that was absolutely wrong, but it was taught in our schools for decades and decades. But right now, the proof is out on the table that their policies have failed. The welfare state, the entitlement system, the inflation system, and the constant wars is a failed system, and it's ruining our country. We have to reverse that direction. Been able to send men and women to Washington that understood the Constitution and promised and lived up to their promises and obeyed the Constitution, we would not have the problems that we have today. Now, if that was the cause of our problem, why wouldn't the solution be make sure we send nobody to Washington, House, Senate, or the presidency that doesn't understand the Constitution, and you believe them when they make a promise that they will obey the Constitution? Government has constantly grown, and therefore the attack on our personal liberties have been constant and steady. The economy now is in shambles because of constant debt, and there's no recognition that the correction for constant debt is liquidation of debt. Get rid of the debt. If you got into trouble and had too much debt, or your business had too much debt, You couldn't have economic growth if your credit ran out unless you got rid of your debt. You'd have to work harder and pay off your debt, get new jobs, or live, more cautiously and live within your means. A country that lives over its means for a long time will be destined to live beneath its means, and that is what's happening right now. The country is poorer because everything is based on debt, and this is the reason the middle class is getting smaller. Middle class is getting poorer, and there's another characteristic of what happens when a country destroys its money and power gravitates into a central location like the federal government. The power then takes the value or takes the wealth of the middle class. It's automatically transferred to the wealthy. And this is what's been happening. During the bubble formation, Wall Street and the banks, they did quite well during the housing bubble. And then they got to gambling. They got to gambling with these derivatives, and they got themselves over their head. They went bankrupt. And then they come rushing for help to the government and the Federal Reserve and say that you got to bail us out. We're too big to fail. We're too big to fail. The whole economy is going to come down if you don't help us. So what did they do? The Congress and the Federal Reserve bailed them out. And what happened to the bad debt that should be liquidated? The bad debt was dumped on the people. That is what happened. And the very people that were supposed to be helped with these government programs and easy credit so everybody would have a house, guess what? They lost their jobs and they lost their houses and they're still suffering. Economic planning doesn't work unless it's done by the people, not by the government or the central bank. We have a system today based on entitlements, and it's based on the assumption that some people have a tough time and we have to help them out, and the bleeding hearts say, look, if you don't want to help the people, that means you're heartless, you don't care about people, you're not a humanitarian. But I've come to the conclusion that the humanitarian instincts of almost all people, whether they disagree on solutions, but we have humanitarian instincts that if the humanitarian instinct drives you to say that we are going to have forced redistribution of wealth, guess what? There's not as much wealth. The humanitarian instinct should drive us to the free market, to property rights and sound money and limited government and less war. Then you will help the maximum number of people, and you will have the largest, wealthiest middle class under those conditions. Entitlement sounds like a good word. It sounds like a right, but the use of the word entitlement today isn't. That means some people believe they're entitled to what you make and earn and produce. But you don't have a right to somebody else's property. But you should have a right and be entitled to keep what you earn. That's what we need. Sold to the masses, and the masses believe they're going to always be taken care of, and you're going to have free education and free houses, free medical care, the whole works. And guess what? The entitlement system is built to really help the very wealthy who know how to manipulate the system. And the poor end up with the crumbs, although they were talked into accepting the entitlement system because they thought they were going to get the help necessary. But today, there is a challenge going on because they talk about the wealthy, and I already have, and criticize those who get bailed out, and the very wealthy who benefit from the destruction of money and through the inflationary system. But you don't want to throw out everybody who's wealthy. There's nothing wrong with being wealthy if you earn your money honestly. That's a big difference. The wealthy get wealthy because they deliver a service to the people. If we make an individual wealthy because they provide a good product and we vote for that product and they become wealthy, but they get no benefits, they get nothing special from the government, no bailouts, no contracts, anything, they should be entitled to keep that. But those who are in the military-industrial complex or in the financial system that benefits from the monetary system that we have, they're not entitled to that. They don't deserve the bailouts, and they should be challenged, so we have to sort out the two. If we do that, I believe we can return to a much more prosperous economy where we can have growth and jobs once again. And it encourages corruption. A lot of people complain about the lobbyists having control, and they do. There's too much control by lobbyists in Washington. But the lobbyist is a consequence. They are the symptom of the problem, because lobbying is something that is encouraged by the fact that the government's running an auction. You know, H.L. Mencken said it was an auction off of stolen goods, and that's what the government does. So people have an incentive, the business people, everybody has an incentive to go to Washington because there's this redistribution of wealth and they have this incentive. Now, what we have to do is get the power out of Washington, get the money out of Washington. You won't have the incentive to go up and try to buy this power and control. But today, we have a system that has been totally undermined, and the special interests do have control of it. But another way we could solve this, if we, once again, had only those people who were dedicated to the Constitution, who weren't influenced by these special interests and couldn't be bought off, this would all come to an end as well. Some people ask me once in a while, well, didn't the lobbyists come to you and lobby you? And I said, well, on occasion they did, but they found out that it didn't do any good, you know. But the system of entitlements is something that has to be addressed, but the other thing that I talk about a whole lot, and the place where I want to do the first cutting, because I do want to start, with a token cut the first year of $1 trillion in 1 year. Of government in the last 40, 50, 60 years has conditioned so many to be so dependent on government, and some are tragically dependent on government. When you think of the elderly dependent on medical care and the children dependent on medical care, I don't believe that is the place where you start to cut. You don't start to cut on the food stamp program because the conditions have been created by bad government. So I want to work our way out of it. I want to have priorities. So where my priorities are to cut the big bucks are the dollars that we spend so foolishly overseas. Had an additional $4 trillion added to it just for the spending overseas. Just think if we had had those strict constitutionalists that I long for in Washington, where we would only go to war with a declaration of war and no other way. Beefs of the founders of the country and the revolutionaries against the British. And the king would go to war, and then they would get taxed to pay for the wars. So we need to go to war only if there's a declaration. If there's a need to it, and to defend this country, we should declare the war as we did in World War II. Go fight and win it and just come home. That's what we need to do. Fighting two huge nations, Germany and Japan. Less than 4 years they were defeated. And yet here we are, we're in Afghanistan, and believe it, we're not out of Iraq yet. I'll tell you, we're in a mess, and they're looking to go into Syria and Iran. It's just constant. But we've been doing this for 10 years. It makes no sense whatsoever, but if we had only gone with a declaration of war, we wouldn't have gone into these wars since, it's Korea, Vietnam, and everything since have been gone basically by the executive branch. So, if you decide that I'm going to be in the executive branch, I will not go to war without a proper directive from the people and the U.S. Congress. under a UN resolution either. Sometimes the reasons they give us are not true. Some people call those lies. But certainly the conditions under which we went into Iraq, they turned out they were not true, and many of us knew they wouldn't be true. But I'll tell you what, things are not a lot different right now. Even though the war drums are beating hard to go to Syria and go to Iran, it's very, very similar to what was happening on the preparation to go into Iraq. The Iraqi war was planned many years before. The first talk in the House floor I ever gave was in 1998, believing that there was war coming, and I was trying to head it off. But that didn't happen until after 9/11. 9/11, a terrible day in our history, but I think it's been misunderstood. I do not believe that we were attacked, nor will we be attacked because we're free and prosperous. I do not believe that is the reason. Crisis, whether it's an economic crisis that requires us to bail out those in privileged positions, or when we have an international crisis like 9/11, it's used as an excuse to do the very things they've been wanting to do all along. Of course, it turned out there were no weapons of mass destruction. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Guess what? There's Al-Qaeda in Iraq today. And this whole idea that, well, we have to go wherever they are. The terrorists are everywhere. And there are Taliban everywhere. We have to kill every Taliban. But you know, the Taliban are not the Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda are radical enough and they're incensed enough that they want to come here and they do want to kill us because of the problems that we've had with our foreign policy. But Taliban are people who want to, just foreigners off their land, whether they're the Soviets or whether it's the United States or the French or the British, they just want to be left alone. And if we're going to try to... that is, if they are defending their homeland and we're trying to kill them and they want to kill us because we're there, the more we go in, the more Taliban there's going to be, the more the people that, it's a catch-22, there's no ending to it. Let them deal with their problems, we'll deal with our problems here at home. They write us off quickly and say, oh, you're a bunch of isolationists. You don't want to deal with the world. But you know what? It's exactly the opposite. Guess who the isolationists are? The isolationists are the ones who want to put sanctions on all these countries to punish them. What do? They really punish them and have an overthrow of government? They solidify the power and bring out their own nationalism. So when we try to punish the Iranians, we solidify the power of Ahmadinejad. It does the opposite. I don't know whether they do it on purpose or they just don't know what they're doing, but it isn't good. It doesn't work. And but sanctions is a part of the isolationism that they accuse us of. And because the founders and what I believe is that we should be friends with as many people as we can, trade with people, and travel with people around the world. Matter of fact, I think it's about time we remove the sanctions from Cuba. Why can't we travel to Cuba? Castros are still there. It didn't work very well. But I'll tell you what, in the theory behind what the founders thought and what free markets describe is that when you're free, having free trade in markets, there's a self-interest involved to stay that way and not fight each other. You know, we were fighting the communists, we were fighting the Chinese, we were fighting the Vietnamese communists, and of course that war went very poorly. We lost that war. We came home. 1 million Vietnamese died, and 60,000 Americans died, but we had to come home. And they warned us. They said there would be this horrible, horrible thing. There would be a domino effect, and and the communists would take over the whole world. Well, guess what? It must be free markets that moved in that direction, left our country, because now our banker's in China. So it hasn't worked all that well. But just think now, we do trade and talk to China under imperfect situations, but just think, we're not killing each other. When I was in high school, we were killing each other. A teacher of mine went off to Korea and didn't come back. Made no sense to me. But what about Vietnam? Now we trade with them, we invest over there, they come over here. Imperfect, we're imperfect, they're imperfect. But just think how much more was achieved in peace, which was never achieved in all that fighting for 20 years. The atmosphere that surrounds war, and various kinds of wars, whether it's the wars overseas, or the atmosphere dealing with civil liberties here at home, when you have another war that goes on against the American people that causes so much trouble and so much undermining of our civil liberties, that is that onerous war on drugs that has caused so much. The war on drugs has been going on. The modern day war on drugs has occurred since the early 1970s. There was a more minimal war prior to that, but prior to 1912, there was no war on drugs, and a lot of people survived, even in those years, when they could go out and buy whatever they wanted. But the war on drugs is very, very dangerous. But the war on drugs is, matter of fact, drugs are very, very dangerous. But the war on drugs, I think, is more dangerous than the drugs themselves. Now, I do want to make a very strong point, both as a physician, as a parent, and as a grandparent. All drugs are dangerous. Illegal drugs are dangerous. The war on drugs are dangerous. But prescription drugs are very dangerous as well. But certainly if we would follow the rules about giving more prerogatives to the states, some states now are just making token efforts to say that people who smoke marijuana for medical reasons should be allowed to. States have passed that. Have the heavy hand of the federal government come down, they undo this whole principle of states' rights and say that we will tell you what you can do. And our federal government has been known to arrest sick people in wheelchairs, individuals who are getting benefits from marijuana, and putting them in prison. That makes no sense whatsoever. But the real harm done by the war on drugs, and we can't dismiss the fact that drugs are very dangerous. But the real danger is the undermining of our personal civil liberties, because that is used as an excuse to invade our homes without search warrants. It's gotten much worse with this other law that was passed after 9/11, and that is called the Patriot Act, which should be repealed. The Patriot Act, as I've said in the debates, is very unpatriotic. The Patriot Act was passed, and that bill was floating around for a long time, and that was an opportunity to pass it and get a bill out there that they wanted to pass all along. But if they would have called that bill Repeal the Fourth Amendment Act, maybe it wouldn't have passed. A bill, and you see the name on a bill going through the Congress, the name is almost always opposite of what it's going to end up doing. So it's a very bad piece of legislation. So I think next year, when we get this opportunity to change some of these things, we should call it. We we shouldn't call it repeal the Patriot Act. What we should do is let's restore the Fourth Amendment Act. Patriot Act that gives cover to many times these SWAT teams have been coming into our homes and into our apartments, breaking in without proper search warrants. Now they can do it wholesale. And lo and behold, I imagine you have heard, there's a few occasions when they actually go into the wrong homes. And they've actually killed the wrong people. They shouldn't even be doing it. But it is out of control. They'll march into our homes without the proper authority. And the Fourth Amendment was supposed to guarantee that we would not be invaded by our government without a proper search warrant.